there is a moment that almost nobody knows about. A private room, somewhere in Los Angeles, 3 years before the world lost Val Kilmer. Kurt Russell sitting across from a man who could barely speak, who had to fight for every word, who had to push through the wreckage of what 2 tracheotomies and years of cancer treatment had done to the voice that once made an entire generation of moviegoers stop breathing. And Val Kilmer, working through the difficulty, working through the effort, looking at one of the only people in his life who had known him before the fame and after the fallout and through all of it, and saying 6 words that stopped Kurt Russell cold. 6 words that Russell carried out of that room and has been carrying ever since. 6 words that contain, if you sit with them long enough, everything important there is to understand about Val Kilmer, about talent, about what a life in the pursuit of something extraordinary actually costs. Russell did not share those words at a press conference. He did not release a statement. He shared them the way you share things that actually matter, in conversation, quietly, to people willing to listen closely. And what he said in full about Val Kilmer, the friendship, the gifts, the genius, the difficulty, the last visit, and those 6 words, is one of the most honest things any person in Hollywood has said about another person in a very long time. That honesty is where this story begins. Because Kurt Russell, at 75, has lived long enough and lost enough to know that the gap between what we say about people and what is actually true about them is where everything real gets buried. He chose not to bury it. He chose to say what was true. And the truth about Val Kilmer is more interesting, more complicated, and more moving than any tribute you have already read. To understand what made the friendship between Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer real rather than merely professional, you have to understand what both men were, underneath the credits, underneath the reputations, underneath the decades of headlines. Russell had been inside the Hollywood machine since he was 12 years old, which means he had been watching it operate from the inside since before most people his age were in high school. He had been the Disney kid, carefully packaged and reliably profitable, and he had spent years quietly building toward the moment when he could detonate that image entirely. That moment came in 1979, when John Carpenter, who had a talent for seeing what actors were concealing behind their public faces, cast him as Elvis Presley in a television film that nobody expected to work, and that became the launching pad for everything Russell actually wanted to do. An Emmy nomination, then Snake Plissken, then R.J. McCready in The Thing, a film that confused and disappointed audiences in 1982 and is now considered one of the defining achievements of its genre. A film that required Russell to hold an entire atmosphere of paranoia together with nothing but physical presence and absolute commitment to a character operating in conditions of total uncertainty. Then Silkwood in 1983, directed by Mike Nichols, starring Meryl Streep, and featuring in a supporting role a young actor named Kurt Russell, who was quietly doing some of the most precise, dramatic work of his career while everyone was looking at Streep. It was on that set that he first encountered Val Kilmer, 22 years old, recently arrived from Juilliard, accompanying his then-girlfriend Cher with the slightly detached, watchful quality of someone who was absorbing everything and filing it away for future use. Russell recognized the quality immediately because he had it himself. 2 people who treated the craft as the most serious thing in any room, who were in the process of becoming what they were going to become, who were both on the verge of something, and who would not work together for another decade, while both of them became legends separately. Val Kilmer's trajectory toward Tombstone moved through a series of performances that form, in retrospect, one of the most remarkable early careers in American film. Youngest person ever admitted to Juilliard's drama program. Broadway, alongside Sean Penn and Kevin Bacon, before most of his generation had done anything worth mentioning. Real Genius in 1985, in which he demonstrated a gift for light comedy that most serious actors are terrified to develop because it looks like a concession. And then Top Gun in 1986, the role he had not wanted, the role he had resisted out of a fear that it would define him as something narrower than he intended to be. Tom Iceman Kazansky, controlled, precise, the best pilot in any room and constitutionally incapable of pretending otherwise, became one of the most studied performances of the blockbuster era, not because Kilmer was menacing, but because he was exact. He and Tom Cruise produced something genuinely unusual in those scenes together. A chemistry built not on friction, but on two people who were each entirely correct and entirely incompatible. And the tension between two kinds of rightness is more compelling than most scripted conflict can manufacture. Top Gun made him a star. Stardom, as it turned out, operated on frequencies that Kilmer's particular instrument was not tuned to receive. He was extraordinary at the thing the camera captured. He was genuinely, constitutionally terrible at everything the industry required around that thing. The managed image, the strategic interviews, the performance of being a movie star that runs parallel to the performance of being an actor. He was not duplicitous about it. He simply could not do it. Directors found him impossible. Joel Schumacher used the words childish and impossible in public. Producers warned each other. The reputation calcified into something that preceded him into every room he entered. And through all of it, he kept giving performances that made people forget, temporarily, everything they had heard. The Doors in 1991, in which Oliver Stone would later confess he sometimes genuinely forgot which man he was watching. True Romance in 1993, a small role in a Tarantino script that let him be loose and funny and surprising. And Tombstone, also 1993, which was where everything came together in a way that even Val Kilmer, who was not given to easy satisfaction, seemed to understand was singular. The production of Tombstone is one of the more extraordinary stories in recent Hollywood history, and it contains within it a fact that has still not been fully absorbed into the public understanding of what the film is. The original director, Kevin Jarre, was replaced during shooting. George Cosmatos received the directing credit. What actually happened, according to multiple sources, including Russell himself, is that Kurt Russell took over the creative direction of the film, working with Cosmatos on the construction of each scene, while simultaneously delivering one of the most internally controlled performances of his career as Wyatt Earp. He was directing the picture and starring in the picture simultaneously, without receiving a directing credit for the former, because the film needed it, and he was not the kind of person who abdicated when something needed to be done. The result of that extraordinary arrangement, that act of professional commitment that went entirely unrecognized at the time, is a film that has spent 30 years growing in stature and now sits comfortably among the finest westerns ever committed to film. And here is the thing about Tombstone that always arrives in any serious discussion of it, the thing that is simultaneously obvious and perpetually surprising. The performance that defines the film, the one that people carry around inside them decades after watching it, the one that determines how the movie is remembered, is not Wyatt Earp. Kurt Russell built that film from the ground up, kept it alive when it might have collapsed, delivered a performance of considerable power and authority. And Val Kilmer walked in and made everyone talk about Doc Holliday. John Henry Doc Holliday, the gambling, tubercular, whiskey-drinking former dentist, with the silver cup and the ivory-handled pistols, and the particular relationship with mortality that comes from knowing your body is already in the process of betraying you. Kilmer played him as a man who had made his peace with dying and found the experience, on balance, clarifying. Not tragic, clarifying. The cough was real in its effect. The weight loss was real. The physical diminishment was total and precise. And underneath all of it, giving the whole performance its specific, irreplaceable charge, was a quality of lightness, a dark, knowing, amused lightness that belongs to people who have genuinely stopped being afraid of the worst thing, because the worst thing is already happening and they are still standing here, still dangerous, still the most interesting person in any room they walk into. When Johnny Ringo challenged him in the street and Kilmer stepped forward, spinning a tin cup on one finger with the same casual, absolute mastery that Ringo was demonstrating with his pistol, the film became something more than a Western. It became a study in what it looks like when a person has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. I'm your Huckleberry, 4 words, delivered once, and they have been living in the permanent vocabulary of American cinema ever since. Val Kilmer said them in a specific way, not threatening, not boastful, but with a particular quality of settled amusement. And in that specific way, they became something that no other actor, in any other reading, has been able to replicate. That is what Tombstone was. That is what Val Kilmer did inside it. When filming ended, the two men exchanged gifts, and the exchange that happened, entirely by accident, without coordination, through the specific intuition of two people who had spent months inside characters that were mirrors of each other, is one of the most quietly astonishing things in the behind-the-scenes history of any film. Russell gave Kilmer a burial plot inside Boot Hill Graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona, the actual historic cemetery where the actual frontier dead were laid to rest. His logic was character logic, the only logic that made sense after months of living inside Wyatt Earp. Doc Holliday had spent the entire film already half dead, oriented toward death the way a compass needle orients toward north, and a burial plot in Boot Hill was the honest gift, the gift that told the truth about who Doc was and what Doc understood. Kilmer independently, without knowledge of what Russell had chosen, gave him an acre of land overlooking Boot Hill, not inside the graveyard, but above it, with a full panoramic view of everything below. Wyatt Earp does not get buried in Boot Hill, Kilmer understood. Wyatt Earp gets to stand above it all and look down on everything that ended and keep living. The two gifts arrived simultaneously and perfectly contradicted each other in the most perfectly complementary way possible. One man giving death to the other's character. One man giving the long view of life. Russell described it to Rolling Stone with a simplicity that stopped the interviewer cold. Doc Holliday was all about death. But Wyatt's all about life. I guess that pretty much says it all. That it did. That it still does. Two men who had understood their characters so completely and each other so intuitively that they arrived independently at gifts that were two halves of the same thought. Russell still has the land, has never let go of it, because the man who understood him that precisely is gone now, and that acre overlooking Boot Hill is what remains of that understanding. The years between Tombstone and the end of Val Kilmer's life moved through Batman Forever and professional turbulence, and the calcifying reputation, and the performances that kept confounding the reputation, and finally, in 2014, the diagnosis that changed the shape of everything. Throat cancer. He kept it private for 2 years, consistent with his Christian Science faith and his deep personal resistance to public vulnerability. When it eventually became known, he described the treatment and its permanent consequences with a directness that surprised people who had formed their understanding of him entirely from second-hand reports. 2 tracheotomies, chemotherapy, radiation, and at the end of it, a voice that had been reduced from the instrument that delivered Iceman and Doc Holliday and Jim Morrison to a rough, difficult whisper. He wrote in 2022 with the same clarity he had always brought to the thing inside the camera's frame. It isn't easy to talk and be understood. He kept working. The documentary Val, in 2021, assembled from decades of obsessive home video footage he had been recording throughout his entire career, showed the work and the joy in the work and the genuine anguish of a man who had spent 40 years chasing something in the craft and was not always certain he had found it. His son Jack narrated it, speaking his father's words in a voice that approximated what his father's voice had been, because Val himself could no longer speak clearly enough to narrate his own life. Tom Cruise fought to bring him back for Top Gun. Maverick in 2022. The scene between Iceman and Maverick, old rivals, finally putting down the contest, finally simply looking at each other and saying what was true between them, was the last thing Val Kilmer filmed. His voice in that scene was digitally reconstructed because he could no longer produce it himself. The scene landed with the specific weight of things that are simultaneously cinema and real life and farewell, because it was all three simultaneously. It was his last film. 3 years before Val Kilmer died, Kurt Russell went to his house. He sat across from a man who had to work for every word, who had to push through genuine physical difficulty to be understood, who was operating in a body that had been fundamentally altered by everything the cancer and the treatment had done. It was hard for him to talk, Russell said afterward. But he had wonderful things to say. He had a good sense of humor. And then Kilmer looked at him and pushed through the difficulty and said the 6 words that Russell walked out of that room carrying. Sometimes I could have been a little bit nicer to a lot of people. And then he laughed. Not bitterly. Not with the collapsed energy of a man surrendering to regret. With genuine, clear-eyed, affectionate amusement at himself, at the full picture of himself. The 360 degrees, the genius and the impossibility and the friction and the loyalty and all of it together. He was not asking for absolution. He was not performing humility. He was looking at himself honestly, from a long view, the way illness sometimes forces people to look, and finding it not unbearable, but even a little funny. That is what Russell saw in that room. That was what he carried out of it. Val Kilmer died on April 1st, 2025, in Los Angeles, from pneumonia, following years of recovery from throat cancer. He was 65 years old. His daughter Mercedes confirmed his passing. He was surrounded by family and the people who had known the full arc of him. The stardom and the genius and the difficulty and the illness and the late, quiet grace that came when he had nothing left to manage and could simply be, finally and completely, himself. The tributes came from everywhere, and most of them were kind and some of them were true, and the truest of all came from Kurt Russell, who did not perform grief but described it, who told the story of the gifts, who told the story of the last visit, who said that everybody has their full 360 degrees and nobody gets out of here alive, and that if anyone deserved to rest in peace it was Val. What Russell gave the world in those words was not a eulogy. It was a portrait drawn from the inside by someone who had known the subject since before he was famous, and after he was famous, and in the last difficult years when the voice was gone and what remained was the essential person underneath everything the world had decided about him. And somewhere in Kurt Russell's house, there is still an acre of land above Boot Hill, chosen by a man who understood, even in 1993, even in the middle of playing a man who is dying, that Wyatt Earp gets the long view. That the person who chooses life gets to stand above the graveyard and see everything. Val Kilmer chose that gift for his friend. He looked at Kurt Russell and saw Wyatt Earp, not the character, but the quality, and gave him land and horizon and the view from above. That instinct, that precision, that ability to see the deeper thing inside the surface of things. That was who Val Kilmer was at the beginning and the middle and the end of it. It is still there every time someone watches Tombstone and hears for words said in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment and feels the hair rise on the back of their neck. Kurt Russell knew it from a set in 1983, when a 22-year-old from Juilliard stood quietly in a corner absorbing everything. Already entirely himself, already carrying something that the camera would eventually find irresistible. That something never left. It cannot be taken. It is what remains after everything else. The reputation, the illness, the voice, the years, has been stripped away. The only thing, in the end, that was always true about him. And the only thing that will still be true about him 100 years from now, when someone puts on Tombstone for the first time and meets Doc Holliday and understands, without being told, that they are watching something that could not have been made by anyone else, in any other way, in any other moment. That is Val Kilmer. That is what Kurt Russell, at 75, chose to say was true. He was right. He was always right about him. From the very first time they were in the same room.